Welcome to another installment of Donning the Armor. This morning we will begin in Leviticus chapter 13, verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, When a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes the skin of his body, on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or one of his sons the priests. The priest shall examine the sore on the skin of the body, and if a hair on the sore has turned white, then the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous sore. So here in 13 and in the next installment in 14, we're going to be looking directly at leprosy. And leprosy in this biblical sense is not just the leprosy we know as Hansen's disease. It goes further than that because it describes more than one condition. And in some cases, a leprosy that is even more deadly and dangerous than Hansen's disease, which in our day and age we can treat and even pretty much cure if it's caught early enough, but can definitely bring about a stalling in it, even if it's caught a little bit later. Leprosy is a horrific disease that robs people of feeling. Yeah, it makes their nerve endings die so that they don't actually feel pain any longer. And because of this, and because especially during the time of the Old Testament, they did not know how it was brought about. They didn't know how contagious it actually was, because it is a person-to-person disease. You can pass it on to somebody. We now know, as far as Hansen's disease is concerned, that portion of leprosy, that it is actually a little bit more difficult to actually pass from one person to the next, but it is possible, and it's a concern. So as we're going through this, we're going to see it talked about in a couple different ways. And first, it's beginning by saying when somebody has one of these things, then they need to be checked out. They need to be brought back. And one of the signs that it's a leprous sore is that the scab or the swelling, the bright spot, it doesn't protrude from the body all the time, but it becomes concave and starts to dip into the skin, lower than the skin. If it starts to dip in lower than the skin, then it's probably a leprous sore. If the hair that is on the sore turns white, especially because these are not a bunch of blue-eyed, blonde-haired Nordics. These are Middle Eastern Jews. They really only come in one hair color, black. So, like, your hair's going to be black until it turns gray. Like, if it's turned white and it's a young man with black hair, you know you have an issue. That this is possibly something bad. So it is a leprous sore. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of the body, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore for 7 days. So if it's not deep, if it's not concave, if it's still there and there's a spot, but the hair's normal, then you need to wait. And you're going to put them away for a week. You're going to isolate them from everybody else. And you're just going to see what happens for the next week. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day. And indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. So he's going to check after 7 days. And if nothing's really changed, and it looks the same, you're going to isolate him another 7 days, because there's still a chance something can happen. Then the priest shall examine him again on the 7th day, and indeed, if the sore has faded, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. Basically, you know what it looks like when you have a scab, but then a scab falls off, you have a white spot left. Well, in these ways, this looks a lot like the diseases they're looking for. So you could have cut yourself, and if someone notices it, and they don't know why it's there, you're going to say, hey, I have this. I don't want to be a threat to the rest of my family. So when after 14 days in this case, if it started to fade away and it's not spread, then they're just going to say, look, he's clean. It was something simple. It was something normal. Of course, after 7 days, if it started to fade, this would be the same thing. It's just telling the priest, hey, if after the 7 days it hasn't changed, then you isolate them another 7 days. But if it had already started to fade after 7 days, you don't need the additional 7 days. But if the scab should at all spread over the skin, after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. So if the scab begins to spread after he's been seen by the priest, then he needs to be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees that the scab has indeed spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. If it continues to get worse, it's leprosy. In a way, it almost reads to me that even after he's been cleansed and considered clean, if it comes back and gets worse, now you know he's probably got leprosy. When the leper sore is on a person, then he shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the swelling on the skin is white, and it has turned the hair white, and there is a spot of raw flesh in the swelling, it is an old leprosy on the skin of his body. The priest shall pronounce him unclean and shall not isolate him, for he is unclean. So if this is an old leper sore, so this is something somebody's now noticing, he's bringing it to the priest, and you can see, no, this has been leprous, and it's been leprous for a while, then there's no isolating him. He's unclean. He needs to be put away. He needs to be put out from the rest of the people for fear that he would contaminate the rest of the people of the congregation. And if leprosy breaks out all over the skin, and the leprosy covers all the skin of one who has the sore, from his head to his foot, wherever the priest looks, then the priest shall consider, and indeed if the leprosy has covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean who has the sore, and is turned all white, he is clean. But when the raw flesh appears on him, he shall be unclean. So basically, if it looks like it was there and healing, if the leprosy, if the sores cover everything, and it is covering everything, he who has the sore is clean, unclean. It's the same basic idea that if it depends on what it looks like to the priest, because these are commands from God. The priest shall examine the raw flesh and pronounce him to be unclean. For the raw flesh is unclean, it is leprosy. So if the wound is open in a way, if it's raw, if the skin is raw and pulled away, then it is unclean and it's leprosy, because in this way it would be contagious and not covered. If the raw flesh changes and turns white again, he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the sore is turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. Who has the sore, he is clean. So if it is white, it means it is healing. So if it is healing, no matter, even if it's all over him, he is clean because it's healing. If it's raw, it means it is not healing, it is getting worse. That is what we are led to believe, and what the priests are being told by God. That if he looks like he's on the mend, then he is clean. Which, if this is why I say that it is leprosy in this biblical case, includes Hansen's disease and worse, but is not limited to Hansen's disease, because in this case, Hansen's disease would not get better on its own. This could be something like he was burned, he had road rash almost, it got white, it got better, he changed back, it was no longer raw. This could be anything. It could be eczema. It looks raw and then it starts to heal, so you know the person's clean, they don't have something contagious. If the body develops a boil in the skin and it is healed, and in the place of the boil there becomes a white swelling or a bright spot, reddish white, then it shall be shown to the priest. And if, when the priest sees it, it indeed appears deeper than the skin, and its hair is turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. is a leper sore, which is broken out of the boil. So boil, painful. If this looks like it's something else is happening, there's a white swelling, there's a bright spot, it becomes reddish white. If it looks like it is not advancing as a boil should advance to be healed, and it looks as though something else is happening, it is a leper sore. He needs to be put away. If the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs on it, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days, and if it should at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leper sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place, and is not spread, it is the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. So, scars leave white spots. That's basically God is trying to limit the amount of judgment calls these priests are going to have. It is incredibly detailed as a way of showing that you are not going to be making just simple judgment calls on these things. You're going to follow my prescription of this, and this is going to lead you for whether or not you decide whether or not something is clean or unclean. And this is also why we are told that Aaron and his sons and all the priesthood should not be drinking. They need to be a complete clear mind, because some of these things are very close to one another to tell whether or not something is getting worse or not. If this white spot is clearing up or not, this matters to these people, because this is being set apart from your entire family. I mean, a leper would be separated from their family forever. You wouldn't attend funerals. You wouldn't attend worship. You would be set apart from seeing your children grow up. You would be cast out of society for this. You would be set apart, and not in a good way. So they needed to be clear-headed about all these things. And I know as we go through it, even I, reading it, will sometimes stop for a second and think, did I just read what I think I read? Because it's a little complicated when you're starting to get over what exactly God is telling them about these sores. But the idea is, when something is healing, your skin is going to look white. And we look at this ourselves when we look at scabs. I remember doing it when I was little, but even with my own kids, you have a scab on it, which my kids seem to get a lot less scabs than I did. But when they have a scab, you look at it, the scab falls off, and it's red. You go, oh, well, that might be getting infected. It's white. You go, okay, it's probably healing. That's what the Lord is saying. Does this look like it's getting worse, or does it look like it's healing? If it's just white and looks like it's getting smaller, it's probably a healing sore, not something getting worse and putting others at risk. Or if the body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white, then the priest shall examine it, and indeed if the hair of the bright spot is turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, it is leprosy broken out in the burn. Therefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leper sore. So basically, a lot of this, to me, in my imperfect view of things, when I see a lot of this and I see leper sore, I'm not thinking Hansen's disease from a burn. What I'm thinking of is infection from a burn. Does this look like it's becoming infected and possibly leading to the ability to develop a leprous-like disease? But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in the bright spot, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days, and the priest shall examine him on the 7 days. If it has at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread on the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn. The priest shall pronounce him clean, for it is a scar from the burn. So there's not a lot of wiggle room here. Is it healing? Is it not healing? Because we do read about leprosy a lot here. And although it can, and there's no real acceptance of exactly what biblical leprosy is, outside of the fact that it is not solely Hansen's disease, that it is something that these people feared could take out entire families. So in that case, it is something that they are looking for and making sure that they do not spread it among their own people, because only bad things would come from that. If a man or a woman has a sore on the head or the beard, then the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed if it appears deeper than the skin, and there is in it thin yellow hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a scaly leprosy of the head or the beard, because once again, they're not blonde people. Black-haired people, they wouldn't have thin yellow hair anywhere. But if the priest examines the scaly sore, and indeed it does not appear deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the scale 7 days. And on the 7th day the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed if the scale has not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, and the scale does not appear deeper than the skin, he shall shave himself, but the scale he shall not shave. And the priest shall isolate the one who has the scale another 7 days. On the 7th day the priest shall examine the scale, and indeed if the scale has not spread over the skin, and does not appear deeper than the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. He shall wash his clothes and be clean. Basically, if there was a scale on the beard, you would shave around the beard, not the scale itself, because you want to see if that hair does become yellow. You want to make sure that spot is the one part that is having hair on it, so you can isolate it to make sure that it's growing from there, not from somewhere else. But if the scale should at all spread over the skin after the cleansing, then the priest should examine him. And indeed, if the scale has spread over the skin, the priest need not seek for yellow hair. He is unclean. Basically, you're not looking for yellow hair if it's starting to spread. You know he's unclean. But if the scale appears to be at a standstill and there is black hair growing up in it, the scale has healed. He is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. We'll also go through in the next chapter how to cleanse, the cleansing of a leper. Now, in that case, they're not talking about different forms of leprosy. Then they're talking basically about Hansen's disease or worse. Something that is what we would traditionally consider leprosy in that case. What they're talking about here is these scales, these different skin issues aren't leprosy, and they are healing. And because of that, these people can be clean and you can move on. Once the leprosy is set in, that's not going to become cleaned. So they need to be separated out. Things that will heal naturally, you can let them go. Things that won't, you need to isolate and remove. If a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of the body, specifically white bright spots, then the priest shall look. And indeed, if the bright spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is a white spot that grows on the skin. He is clean. As we age, we get these white spots, these, I just lost the word for it. But, vitiligo? I think it might be vitiligo. Where your skin just turns white. The pigment in your skin kind of bleaches. It becomes white. And we get these more and more. Some people get them young. Some people get it really bad when they're young. But as you get older, pretty much lots of people get these spots. And this is what it's saying. If you get these spots, it's just a spot. It's natural. He's clean. As for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he is bald, but he is clean. I love that verse so much. Because it's just saying, look, his hair didn't fall out because of a disease. He's just bald, and he's clean. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead, he is bald on the forehead, but he is clean. Just in case people are saying, well, he's not completely bald. He's still got hair on the back of his head, but his forehead, is he diseased? No, he's just bald in his forehead. Or as the King James says, he is forehead bald, but he is clean. And if on the bald head or the bald forehead, a reddish white sore it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine it, and indeed, if the swelling of the sore is reddish white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, as the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the body, he is a leprous man, he is unclean, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. His sore is on his head. So in this way, it's saying, look, if there's sores there, now he's losing his hair because of the leprosy. The leprosy is killing the skin, and the hair is falling out because it's killing the roots. This is an issue. He is unclean, and he needs to be set out. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean all the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So this is saying, with all these things, all these decisions about whether a person was clean or unclean, leprous or unleprous, this is saying, now when you do find this leper, when he is confirmed to have leprosy, his clothes are going to be torn, his head is going to be shaved, and he shall cover his mustache. And he will have the responsibility of crying out, unclean, unclean, when he comes within a certain distance of the people. That way everyone knows he is a leper and not to come close to him. And that is such a tragic and horrible way to live a life. And it's heartbreaking to think that people had to go through this. But also it is a reminder that we are not guaranteed an easy walk, even if we are in the presence of the Lord. That our lives aren't guaranteed to be all unicorns and rainbows. We are going to have trial and tribulation and tragedy just as unbelievers. It rains on the just and the unjust alike. And this is the sight of someone being rained upon, whether they were just or unjust. Disease didn't come for the sinner. It came for the person because they live in a sinful world. And when he is unclean, he was unclean for all the days that he has the sore. And in the case of leprosy, there would be no day that he did not have it. There was no cleansing of this. They have records on the books for how to deal with somebody who comes back to the priesthood having been cleansed of leprosy, but there were none who were cleansed. We'll go over that in chapter 14. Also, if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it is woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it is in the warp or the woof of the linen or wool, whether it in leather or in anything made of leather, and if the plague is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather, whether in the warp or the woof, or in anything made of leather, is a leprous plague and shall be shown to the priest. So here we go for leprous plague, also having to understand that it is not limited to Hansen's disease, because garments don't get Hansen's disease. Wool doesn't get Hansen's disease. This is more than likely talking about mold. It is talking about mold and black mold, things that could cause sickness among the people because it's spreading in a garment, because it's going to be around and the spores are going to be people. There is some kind of mold that is coming out from these garments that would make people sick. The priest shall examine the plague and isolate that which has the plague 7 days, and he shall examine the plague on the 7th day. If the plague is spread in the garment, either in the warp or the woof, in the leather or in anything made of leather, the plague is an active leprosy, it is unclean. He shall therefore burn the garment in which is the plague, whether warp or woof, in wool or in linen, or anything of leather, for it is an active leprosy. The garment shall be burned in the fire. But if the priest examines it, and indeed the plague has not spread in the garment, either in the warp or the woof, or in anything made of leather, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which is the plague, and he shall isolate it another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine the plague after it had been washed, and indeed if the plague had not changed its color, though the plague has not spread, it is unclean, and you shall burn it in the fire. It continues eating away, whether the damage is outside or inside. So basically, if it is shown to have an active plague, it needs to be destroyed. It can cause disease among the people. It needs to be destroyed. Utterly destroyed, and just be done with it and find something else. If the priest examines it, indeed the plague has faded after washing it. But if it appears, let me see. If the priest examines it, indeed the plague has faded after washing it, then he shall tear it out of the garment, whether out of the warp or out of the woof or out of the leather. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof or anything made of leather, it is a spreading plague. You shall burn it with fire, that in which is the plague. And if you wash the garment, either the warp or the woof or whatever made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it shall be washed a second time, and it shall be clean. So if there are certain ways, if it's there, if it's faded, you can cut that part out and patch it. But if it then appears again in the garment, you just destroy the garment, because obviously it didn't get everything out. Everything that was unclean was not out. It was still there. Therefore, it needs to be destroyed. But if not, if it comes out in the washing, wash it again. It's clean. This is the law of the leprous plague in a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof or anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or pronounce it unclean. So you can see from that it is not just limited to Hansen's disease. It is not just limited to the plague of people, but also plagues and leprosy as considered to being mold, mildew, things that could cause disease in and among people, in groups of people, that they also need to be set apart, where the people will be set apart to live whatever poor life they can. Garments and the like, they need to be destroyed. They need to be destroyed for the public health safety of the congregation. We live in a time where that is become a burden for people in a lot of ways, but we also live in a time where we need to lead as Christians and understand that when it comes to public safety, there is a truth to it. That though we have governments who like to use that as a wedge to force more power into their own hands, we do have a responsibility to the health and safety of our brethren. That when we see things that could affect our brethren, we need to help them pull that out of their lives. And the easiest thing we can think of is sin itself. We are not told to not judge people. That's what the world mistranslates and misappropriates from Jesus and a Christian walk. That we are not to be judgmental. And we aren't when it comes to condemnation, but we are to be inspectors of fruit. We are to be able to look at our brothers and sisters, at our brethren, and look and say, look, you're not walking as you should. You need to remove this from you because it's spreading. And if you need to pluck out this out of your life, as much as it may hurt, it is better to go in without that. Enter the presence of the Lord without that than be separated from Him forever. No sin is tolerated. It is forgiven, but not tolerated. And that's a completely different thing. We minister to the sinner. We don't affirm their sin. We love them and try to lead them to a better life, but we don't affirm the sinfulness they live in. We need to make sure that we are helping them remove the plagues in their lives, to inspect their garments, the garments of what they are wearing out in the world. Not their clothes, but what they are putting forth and what people can see, what they are reflecting and spreading into the world around them. And if they are doing sinful things and it is creeping into other portions of their lives, we need to help them cut it out and burn it. Get rid of it. That way they can come to the Lord clean and back to a right standing with Him. The sin will be forgiven, but the walk should be pure and set apart. We should be holy because He is holy. And we can't lead people to a holy God if we aren't at least doing our imperfect best to keep ourselves holy as well. That's where we will end it for this morning. I hope this was fruitful for you. I hope to see you again next time. But until then, be blessed.